All right. And with chapter 9, we come to the close of the great tragedy, the great American tragedy of the Great Gatsby. Real quick, let's just review chapter 8. We know that Nick spends time with Gatsby after Daisy kills Myrtle in the yellow car. And during this time, Gatsby shares his past and how and why he fell in love with Daisy. And Nick, throughout this entire time, doesn't want to leave Gatsby because there's some sneaking suspicion that Gatsby's not okay or something's going to happen. Finally, he pulls himself away and goes to work. In the meantime, he tells us also what is going on with George Wilson at this point in time, right after Myrtle's death. And George is being watched over by the other men in the Valley of Ashes, primarily Michaelis. And he's talking about God and the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg and him and Myrtle and their kind of last conversations before she ends up dying. Michaelis leaves and he comes back. George Wilson is gone. And apparently during this time, George has been trying to find out who is the owner of the yellow car. And finally comes on to the name of Gatsby. He goes to Gatsby's house, hunts him down, shoots him while Gatsby is in the pool waiting for Daisy to call him or Daisy to come over and visit him. And after George Wilson kills Gatsby, he then kills himself. Nick finds Gatsby, and that's essentially where we left off for chapter 9. So if you turn to chapter 9 in my book, it starts at page 163. After 2 years, I remember the rest of that day and the night and the next day only as an endless drill of police and photographers and newspapermen in and out of Gatsby's front door. A rope stretched across the main gate, and a policeman by it kept out the curious, but little boys soon discovered that they could enter through my yard, and there were always a few of them clustered open-mouthed about the pool. Someone with a positive manner, perhaps a detective, used the expression madman as he bent over Wilson's body that afternoon, and the adventitious authority of his voice set the key for the newspaper reports the next morning. Most of those reports were a nightmare, grotesque, circumstantial, eager, and untrue. When Michaelis's testimony at the inquest brought to light Wilson's suspicions of his wife, I thought the whole tale would shortly be served up in a racy pasquinade. But Catherine, Myrtle's sister, who might have said anything, didn't say a word. She showed a surprising amount of character about it, too. Looked at the coroner with determined eyes under that corrected brow of hers, and swore that her sister had never seen Gatsby, that her sister was completely happy with her husband, that her sister had been into no mischief whatsoever. She convinced herself of it, and cried into her handkerchief, as if the very suggestion was more than she could endure. So Wilson was reduced to a man, deranged by grief, in order that the case might remain in its simplest form, and it rested there. So Gatsby was obviously a very public figure with his rise to wealth and all the parties that he was throwing. And so there are newspapermen and reporters and obviously all the police that are involved in a murder investigation, but also that's heightened by Gatsby's notoriety. Catherine, Myrtle's sister, is interviewed, and she obviously is trying to preserve the reputation of her sister by saying that she was very happy in her marriage. And so there's no blame on Myrtle whatsoever, just the fact that George was just so saddened by grief that he went and found whoever killed his wife, not that he was also motivated by seeking out vengeance for the man that also had an affair with her. But all this part of it seemed remote and unessential. I found myself on Gatsby's side, and alone. From the moment I telephoned the news of the catastrophe to West Egg Village, every surmise about him and every practical question was referred to me. At first, I was surprised and confused. Then, as he lay in his house and didn't move or breathe or speak, hour upon hour, it grew upon me that I was responsible because no one else was interested. Interested, I mean, with that intense personal interest to which everyone has some vague right at the end. So he is alone in trying to handle Gatsby's affairs and trying to handle his funeral. And it's still hitting him that Gatsby is dead. And nobody else is there taking care of Gatsby. No friends, no family. So it's up to Nick. I called up Daisy half an hour after we found him. Called her instinctively and without hesitation. But she and Tom had gone away early that afternoon and taken baggage with them. Left no address? No. Say when they'd be back? No. Any idea where they are, how I could reach them? I don't know, can't say. I wanted to get somebody for him. I wanted to go into the room where he lay and reassure him. I'll get somebody for you, Gatsby, don't worry. Just trust me, I'll get somebody for you. So Daisy and Tom have skipped town. They know Gatsby's dead. They know that they could somehow be involved, and they have ditched town without any notice. Meyer Wolfsheim's name wasn't in the phone book. The butler gave me his office address on Broadway, and I called information. But by the time I had the number, it was long after 5, and no one answered the phone. Will you ring again? I've rung them 3 times. It's very important. Sorry, I'm afraid no one's there. I went back to the drawing room and thought for an instant that they were chance visitors, all these official people who suddenly filled it. But as they drew back the sheet and looked at Gatsby with unmoved eyes, his protest continued in my brain. So it's as if he's hearing Gatsby's voice in his head. Look here, old sport. You've got to get somebody for me. You've got to try hard. I can't go through this alone. Somebody started to ask me questions, but I broke away and going upstairs looked hastily through the unlocked parts of his desk. He'd never told me definitely that his parents were dead, but there was nothing, only a picture of Dan Cody, a token of forgotten violence, staring down from the wall. Next morning, I sent the butler to New York with a letter to Wolfsheim, which asked for information and urged him to come out on the next train. That request seemed superfluous when I wrote it. I was sure he'd start when he saw the newspapers, just as I was sure there'd be a wire from Daisy before noon. But neither a wire nor Mr. Wolfsheim arrived. No one arrived except more police and photographers and newspapermen. When the butler brought back Wolfsheim's answer, I began to have a feeling of defiance, of scornful solidarity between Gatsby and me against them all. Dear Mr. Carroway, this has been one of the most terrible shocks of my life to me, and I hardly can believe that it is true at all. Such a mad act as that man did make us all think. I cannot come down now, as I am tied up in some very important business and cannot get mixed up in this thing now. If there is anything I can do a little later, let me know in a letter by Edgar. I hardly know where I am when I hear about a thing like this, and am completely knocked down and out. Yours truly, Meyer Wolfsheim. And then hastily addended beneath, let me know about the funeral, etc. Do not know his family at all. When the phone rang that afternoon and long distance said Chicago was calling, I thought this would be Daisy at last. But the connection came through as a man's voice, very thin and far away. This is Slagle speaking. Yes, the name was unfamiliar. Hell of a note, isn't it? Get my wire? There haven't been any wires. Young Park's in trouble, he said rapidly. They picked him up when he handed the bonds over the counter. They got a circular from New York giving him numbers just 5 minutes before. What do you know about that, hey? You can never tell in these hick towns. Hello, I interrupted breathlessly. Look here. This isn't Mr. Gatsby. Mr. Gatsby's dead. There was a long silence on the other end of the wire, followed by an exclamation, then a quick squawk as the connection was broken. So you know how Gatsby kept getting those phone calls? New York's calling, Chicago's calling, whatever. Those are probably his associates in the mob and whatever criminal business that he was running. And so this guy, Mr. Slagle, is calling, thinking that Gatsby is still alive and still trying to do business and inform Gatsby of what's going on in their, criminal activities. And then Nick says, "Hey, this isn't Gatsby. Gatsby's dead," and automatically the network is or the connection is cut. I think it was on the 3rd day that a telegram signed Henry C. Gatz arrived from a town in Minnesota. It said only that the sender was leaving immediately and to postpone the funeral until he came. It was Gatsby's father. So really quick, before I go on, the fact that Meyer Wolfsheim's only sending a letter, that Slagle doesn't even say anything, that nobody is coming except newspapermen, photographers, and policemen are coming after they hear about Gatsby's death. What does that tell us about Gatsby? And what does this say about the people who associated with him? Did they truly care about him? I mean, in this picture, and this is a screenshot from the movie, it's only Nick. Only Nick is there to defend him, to settle things, to get in contact with people, and nobody, not even Daisy, the woman who supposedly loved him, is there to help with Gatsby's funeral. So again, what does that say about Gatsby's relationships and all of the people who surrounded him? So anyway, we know now that Gatsby's father is coming from Minnesota. It was Gatsby's father, a solemn old man, very helpless and dismayed, bundled up in a long, cheap ulster against the warm September day. His eyes leaked continuously with excitement, and when I took the bag and umbrella from his hands, he began to pull so incessantly at his sparse gray beard that I had difficulty in getting off his coat. He was on the point of collapse, so I took him into the music room and made him sit down while I sent for something to eat. But he wouldn't eat, and the glass of milk spilled from his trembling hand. I saw it in the Chicago paper, he said. It was all in the Chicago newspaper. I started right away. I didn't know how to reach you. His eyes, seeing nothing, moved ceaselessly about the room. It was a madman, he said. He must have been mad. Wouldn't you like some coffee? I urged him. I don't want anything. I'm all right now, Mr. Caraway. Well, I'm all right now. Where have they got Jimmy? Notice this is the first time that Jimmy, this name, this kind of kid nickname has been used. And again, it communicates this father's view of his son. He's still his little boy. I took him into the drawing room where his son lay and left him there. Some little boys had come up on the steps and were looking into the hall. When I told them who had arrived, they went reluctantly away. After a little while, Mr. Gatz opened the door and came out, his mouth ajar, his face slightly flushed, his eyes leaking isolated and unpunctual tears. He had reached an age where death no longer has the quality of ghastly surprise. And when he looked around him now for the first time and saw the height and splendor of the hall and the great rooms opening out from it into other rooms, his grief began to be mixed with an odd pride. I helped him to a bedroom upstairs while he took off his coat and vest, and I told him that all arrangements had been deferred until he came. I didn't know what you'd want, Mr. Gatsby. Gatz is my name. Mr. Gatz. I thought you might want to take the body west. He shook his head. Jimmy always liked it better down east. He rose up his position in the east. Were you a friend of my boy's, Mr.? We were close friends. He had a big future before him, you know. He was only a young man, but he had a lot of brain power here. He touched his head impressively, and I nodded. If he'd lived, he'd been a great man, a man like James J. Hill. He'd have helped and build up the country. That's true, I said, uncomfortably. He fumbled at the embroidered coverlet, trying to take it from the bed, and lay down stiffly, was instantly asleep. That night, an obviously frightened person called up and demanded to know who I was before he would give his name. So real quick, this is his dad, right? And it's funny and ironic seeing that Nick is calling his dad Mr. Gatsby when his dad has to keep correcting him. No, it's Mr. Gatz, right? Because again, this persona of who Gatsby was versus who he created himself to be is still something that is incongruous right now in Nick's mind. And we also know that this is the father, right? The father is seeing his son, who he knew as young and intelligent and bright, was going to do great things, is now dead. And in the midst of that grief, he's also looking around and seeing the house and this life that Gatsby had built for himself, and is simultaneously sad, but also in awe of everything that his son had accomplished. And so now there's another person calling up on the phone. This is Mr. Caraway, I said. Oh, he sounded relieved. This is Klipspringer. So remember, Klipspringer is the man who was the boarder who played the organ. And so this guy's calling up. I was relieved too, for that seemed to promise another friend at Gatsby's grave. I didn't want it to be in papers and draw a sightseeing crowd, so I'd been calling up a few people myself. They were hard to find. The funeral's tomorrow, I said. 3:00, here at the house. I'd wish you'd tell anybody who would be interested. Oh, I will, he broke out hastily. Of course, I'm not likely to see anybody, but if I do. His tone made me suspicious. Of course, you'll be there yourself. Well, I'll certainly try. What I called up about is— Wait a minute, I interrupted. How about saying you'll come? Well, the truth of the matter is that I'm staying with some people up here in Greenwich, and they rather expect me to be with them tomorrow. In fact, there's a sort of picnic or something. Of course, I'll do my very best to get away. I ejaculated an unrestrained huh, and he must have heard me, for he went on nervously. What I called up about was a pair of shoes I left there. I wonder if it'd be too much trouble to have the butler send them on. You see, they're my tennis shoes, and I'm sort of helpless without them. My address is care of B.F. I didn't hear the rest of the name because I hung up the receiver. And I felt a certain shame for Gatsby. One gentleman to whom I telephoned implied that he got what he deserved. However, that was my fault, for he was one of those who used to sneer most bitterly at Gatsby on the courage of Gatsby's liquor, and I should have known better than to call him. The morning of the funeral, I went up to New York to see Meyer Wolfsheim. I couldn't seem to reach him any other way. The door that I pushed open on the advice of the elevator boy was marked the Swastika Holding Company, and at first there didn't seem to be anyone inside. But when I'd shouted, "Hello!" several times in vain, an argument broke out behind a partition, and presently a lovely Jewess appeared at an interior door and scrutinized me with black, hostile eyes. "Nobody's in," she said. "Mr. Wolfsheim's gone to Chicago." The first part of this was obviously untrue, for someone had begun to whistle "The Rosary" tunelessly inside. "Please say that Mr. Carroway wants to see him." I can't get him back from Chicago, can I?" At this moment, unmistakably, Wolfsheim's called "Stella!" from the other side of the door. "Leave your name on the desk," she said quickly. "I'll give it to him when he gets back." "But I know he's there." She took a step toward me and began to slide her hands indignantly up and down her hips. "You young men think you can force your way in here at any time," she scolded. "We're getting sick and tired of it. When I say he's in Chicago, he's in Chicago." I mentioned Gatsby. "Oh." She looked me over again. "Will you just— what was your name?" She vanished. In a moment, Meyer Wolfsheim stood solemnly in the doorway, holding out both hands. He drew me into his office, remarking in a reverent voice that it was a sad time for all of us, and offered me a cigar. "My memory goes back to when I first met him," he said. "A young major, just out of the army and covered over with medals he got in the war. He was so hard up he had to keep on wearing his uniform because he couldn't buy some regular clothes. First time I saw him was when he come into Weinbrenner's pool room at 43rd Street and asked for a job. He hadn't eaten anything for a couple of days. 'Come on, have lunch with me,' I said. He ate more than $4 worth of food in half an hour." "Did you start him in business?" I inquired. "Start him? I made him." "Oh." "I raised him up out of nothing, right out of the gutter. I saw right away he was a fine appearing, gentlemanly young man, and when he told me he was in Oxford, I knew I could use him good. I got him to join up the American Legion, and he used to stand high there. Right off he did some work for a client of mine up to Albany. We are so thick like that and everything." He held up two bulbous fingers. "Always together." I wondered if this partnership had included the World Series transaction in 1919. "Now he's dead," I said after a moment. "You were his closest friend, so I know you'll want to come to his funeral this afternoon." "I'd like to come." "Well, come then." The hair of his nostrils quivered slightly, and as he shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. "I can't do it. I can't get mixed up in it," he said. "There's nothing to get mixed up in. It's all over now. When a man gets killed, I never like to get mixed up in it anyway. I keep out. When I was a young man, it was different. If a friend of mine died, no matter how, I stuck with him to the end. You may think it's that sentimental, but I mean it, to the bitter end." I saw that for some reason of his own, he was determined not to come. So I stood up. "Are you a college man?" he inquired suddenly. For a moment, I thought he was going to suggest a connection, but he only nodded and shook my hand. "Let us learn to show our friendship for a man when he is alive and not after he is dead," he suggested. "After that, my own rule is to let everything alone." So again, this guy's involved in the mob, so he probably doesn't want to get associated with a death of another person involved in the mob, right? That would be bad publicity for him. When I left his office, the sky had turned dark, and I got back to West Egg in a drizzle. After changing my clothes, I went next door and found Mr. Gatz walking up and down excitedly in the hall. His pride in his son and in his son's possessions was continually increasing, and now he had something to show me. So really quick, let's review. So we have on the screen, we have Mr. Gatsby's father. He's come. We know that the Buchanans have ditched town, leaving this mess for everyone else. So they're not coming to the funeral. We know that Klipspringer, the boarder, who just is on the screen right now, only called to get his tennis shoes, and isn't coming to the funeral, even though he stayed with Gatsby for months on end because he and his friends are going to a picnic. He's not coming. And finally, we know Meyer Wolfsheim, because of his association in the mob, is also not coming. It's pretty depressing, right? All of these people who are supposed to be the closest people to Gatsby will not even bother coming or thinking about coming to his funeral. And now we're back to Mr. Gatsby, or Mr. Gats. Jimmy sent me this picture. He took out his wallet with trembling fingers. Look there. It was a photograph of the house, cracked in the corners and dirty with many hands. He pointed out every detail to me eagerly. Look there, and then saw admiration from my eyes. He had shown it so often that I think it was more real to him now than the house itself. Jimmy sent it to me. I think it's a very pretty picture. It shows up well. Very well. Had you seen him lately? He come out to see me 2 years ago and bought me the house I live in now. Of course, we was broke up when he run off from home, but I see now that there was a reason for it. He knew he had a big future in front of him, and ever since he made a success, he was very generous with me. He seemed reluctant to put away the picture, held it for another minute lingeringly before my eyes, then returned the wallet and pulled from his pocket a ragged old copy of a book called Hop Along Cassidy. Look here. This book is what he had when he was a boy. It just shows you. He opened it up, the back cover, and turned it around for me to see. On the last flyleaf was printed the word schedule and the date September 12th, 1906, and underneath, rise from bed, 6 a.m. Dumbbell exercise and wall scaling, 6:15 to 6:30. Study electricity, etc., 7:15 to 8:15. Work, 8:30 to 4:30 p.m. Baseball and sports, 4:30 to 5. Practice elocution, poise, and how to attain it, 5 o'clock to 6. Study needed inventions, 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock. General resolves, no wasting time at shafters, or a name indecipherable. No more smoking or chewing. Bathe every other day. Read one improving book or magazine per week. Save $5, crossed out, $3 per week. Be better to parents. I come across this book by accident, said the old man. It just shows you, don't it? It just shows you. Jimmy was bound to get ahead. He always had some resolves like this or something. Do you know what he's got about improving his mind? He was always great for that. He told me I ate like a hog once, and I beat him for it. So just like we have you guys set goals and stuff at the beginning of the semester, Gatsby did that on his own. And this was before he even met Dan Cody. This was when he was 17 and younger. He had a very strict schedule. He knew what he wanted, and he knew exactly what he needed to do to get there. He needed to exercise. He needed to get up early. He needed to study and practice speaking and poise and manners. And he needed to come up with resolves, just like you guys, okay, I'm not going to watch TV while I do homework, right? For him, it was no wasting time at a bar. Don't smoke or chew tobacco. Make sure I clean myself. Make sure I have a savings account. And again, all of these things he was doing at your age and before. And all of these things helped lead to that disciplined life where he was able to rise to the top, at least in the new money standing. He was reluctant to close the book, reading each item aloud and then looking eagerly at me. I think he rather expected me to copy down the list for my own use. A little before 3, the Lutheran minister arrived from Flushing, and I began to look involuntarily out the windows for other cars. So did Gatsby's father. And as the time passed, and the servants came in and stood waiting in the hall, his eyes began to blink anxiously, and he spoke of the rain in a worried, uncertain way. So I took him aside and looked to him to wait for half an hour, but it wasn't any use. Nobody came. About 5 o'clock, our procession of 3 cars reached the cemetery and stopped in a thick drizzle beside the gate. First a motor hearse, horribly black and wet, then Mr. Gats and the minister and I in the limousine, and a little later 4 or 5 servants and the postman from West Egg, in Gatsby's station wagon, all wet to the skin. As we started through the gate into the cemetery, I heard a car stop, and the sound of someone splashing after us over the soggy ground. I looked around. It was the man with owl-eyed glasses whom I had found marveling over Gatsby's books in the library one night 3 months before. I'd never seen him since then. I don't know how well he knew about the funeral or even his name. The rain poured down his thick glasses, and he took them off and wiped them to see the protecting canvas unrolled from Gatsby's grave. I tried to think about Gatsby then for a moment, but he was already too far away, and I could only remember without resentment that Daisy hadn't sent a message or a flower. Dimly, I heard someone murmur, "Blessed are the dead that the rain falls upon." And then the owl-eyed man said, "Amen to that," in a brave voice. We straggled down quickly through the rain to the cars. Owl Eyes spoke to me by the gate. "I couldn't get to the house," he remarked. Neither could anybody else. "Go on," he started. "Why, my God, they used to go there by the hundreds." He took off his glasses and wiped them again, outside and in. "The poor son of a bitch," he said. So it's interesting that out of all the people that come, it's only Nick, Gatsby's dad, some of the servants, a postman from West Egg, and then Owl Eyes. And remember, Owl Eyes was in chapter 3 when we went to Gatsby's party for the first time, and he was slightly drunk and looking at all the books and exclaiming, "My God, they're real. This guy's a regular Belasco, this artist." Um, and there's multiple things that you can think about with why did he choose to come? They didn't have necessarily a close relationship. But there is this idea that Owl Eyes appreciates Gatsby's art and his style and the fact that he was able to do what many people couldn't. So there's that idea too. But even he, who is this kind of outsider who has come, is remarking on the fact that Gatsby, who threw these parties, who was hyper generous, overly hospitable, that not one of those people who essentially used him even came to see him buried. And just this sad, sad tragedy in that. One of my most vivid memories is of coming back west from prep school and later from college at Christmas time. Those who went farther than Chicago would gather in the old dim Union Station at 6 o'clock of a December evening, with a few Chicago friends already caught up into their own holiday gaieties, to bid them a hasty goodbye. I remember the fur coats of the girls returning from Miss This's or That's, and the chatter of frozen breath and the hands waving overhead as we caught sight of old acquaintances, and the matchings of invitations. Are you going to the Ordways, the Herseys, the Schultzes? And the long green tickets clasped tight in our gloved hands. And last, the murky yellow cars of Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, looking cheerful as Christmas itself on the tracks beside the gate. When we pulled out into the winter night and the real snow, our snow, began to stretch out beside us and twinkle against the windows, and the dim lights of small Wisconsin stations moved by, a sharp, wild brace suddenly came into the air. We drew in deep breaths of it as we walked back from dinner through the cold vestibules, unutterably aware of our identity within the country for one strange hour before we melted indistinguishably into it again. That's my Middle West. Not the wheat or the prairies or the lost Swede towns, but the thrilling returning of trains of my youth, and the street lamps and the sleigh bells and the frosty dark, and the shadows of holly wreaths thrown by lighted windows on the snow. I am a part of that, a little solemn with the feel of those long winters, a little complacent from growing up in the Caraway house in a city where dwellings are still called through decades by a family's name. I see now that this has been a story of the West, after all. Tom and Gatsby, Daisy and Jordan and I were all Westerners. And perhaps we possessed some deficiency in common which made us subtly unadaptable to Eastern life. Even when the East excited me most, even when I was most keenly aware of its superiority to the bored, sprawling, swollen towns beyond Ohio, with the interminable inquisitions which spared only the children and the very old, even then it had always for me a quality of distortion. West Egg especially still figures in my more fantastic dreams. I see it as a night scene by El Greco, 100 houses at once conventional and grotesque, crouching under a sullen, overhanging sky and a lusterless moon. In the foreground, 4 solemn men in dress suits are walking along the sidewalk with a stretcher on which lies a drunken woman in a white evening dress. Her hand, which dangles over the side, sparkles cold with jewels. Gravely, the men turn in at the house, the wrong house. But no one knows that woman's name, and no one cares. After Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me like that, distorted beyond my eyes' power of correction. So when the blue smoke of brittle leaves was in the air and the wind blew the wet laundry stiff on the line, I decided to come back home. So because of everything that happened, Gatsby's death, just seeing the shallowness and the lack of care that other people showed him, and these people who claimed to love him, who claimed to be their friends, who claimed some part of Gatsby, after seeing that nobody cared, and the winter's starting to come, he was just tired of it, and he's like, you know what, I'm gonna go home. And then he comments, he says, all of these main characters, myself, Gatsby, Jordan, Nick, Daisy, are all from the West. And maybe this story is a commentary on the fact that Westerners can't survive in the East. But again, he says he left because it was haunted. There was one thing to be done before I left, an awkward, unpleasant thing that perhaps had better been left alone. But I wanted to leave things in order and not just trust obliging an indifferent sea to sweep my refuse away. So he wants to get his affairs in order, unlike the Buchanans did, unlike people did with Gatsby. He wants to kind of close everything up on his own. I saw Jordan Baker, and I talked over and around what happened to us together, and what had happened afterward to me, and she lay perfectly still, listening in a big chair. She was dressed to play golf, and I remember thinking she looked like a good illustration, her chin raised a little jauntily, her hair the color of an autumn leaf, her face the same brown tint as a fingerless glove on her knee. When I had finished, she told me, without comment, that she was engaged to another man. I doubted that, though there were several she could have married at the nod of her head, but I pretended to be surprised. Remember, he knows that Jordan is a liar. For just a minute, I wondered if I wasn't making a mistake. Then I thought it all over again quickly and got up to say goodbye. Nevertheless, you did throw me over, said Jordan suddenly. You threw me over the telephone. I don't give a damn about you now. But it was a new experience for me, and I felt dizzy for a while. We shook hands. Oh, and do you remember, she added, a conversation we had once about driving a car? Why, not exactly. You said a bad driver was only safe until she met another bad driver. Well, I met another bad driver, didn't I? I mean, it was careless of me to make such a wrong guess. I thought you were rather an honest, straightforward person. I thought it was your secret pride. I'm 30, I said. I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honor. She didn't answer. Angry and half in love with her, and tremendously sorry, I turned away. One late afternoon in October, I saw Tom Buchanan. He was walking ahead of me on Fifth Avenue in his alert, aggressive way, his hands out a little from his body as if to fight off interference, his head moving sharply here and there, adapting itself to his restless eyes. Just as I slowed up to avoid overtaking him, he stopped and began frowning into the windows of a jewelry store. Suddenly he saw me and walked back, holding out his hand. What's the matter, Nick? Do you object to shaking hands with me? Yes, you know what I think of you. You're crazy, Nick, he said quickly. Crazy as hell. I don't know what's the matter with you. Tom, I inquired, what did you say to Wilson that afternoon? He stared at me without a word, and I knew I had guessed right about those missing hours. I started to turn away, but he took a step after me and grabbed my arm. So remember, we know that George was upset. We know that he was depressed. We know that Michaelis was taking care of him. And yet he then disappears. And all we know is that he was asking around about the yellow car. And somehow, somewhere, someone gave him Gatsby's name. And that's how he found Gatsby and killed him. And so Nick has guessed and is now checking to see if his guess is accurate about that little missing period of time to see, well, how the heck did George get the name in the first place? And so here is Tom's answer. I told him the truth, he said. He came to the door while we were getting ready to leave, and when I sent down word that we weren't in, he tried to force his way upstairs. He was crazy enough to kill me if I hadn't told him who owned the car. His hand was on a revolver in his pocket every minute he was in the house. He broke off defiantly. What if I did tell him? That fellow had it coming to him. He threw dust in your eyes just like he did in Daisy's, but he was a tough one. He ran over Myrtle like you'd run over a dog and never even stopped his car. There was nothing I could say, except the one unutterable fact that it wasn't true. So there are two lies here. And one is a lie of omission on Tom's part, and the other one is a lie of Daisy's. I have underlined the areas in which in which these lies are found, right? The first one is the lie of omission, in that Tom didn't bother to correct George's assumption that Gatsby was the one who killed him and the one who was having an affair. Neither did he even try to notice that George was in a bad place and had a gun. He felt his life was threatened, and he knew that he would probably die if he didn't say or answer the question. But he didn't then think about, okay, well, if I answer this, then this means that Gatsby's going to die. Or not that he didn't think about it, he knew that, and yet he said it anyway. And so Tom, in a very large part, is responsible for George's coming after Gatsby, because he was the one that finally gave George Gatsby's name. Now, the second lie is a lie on Daisy's part, because Daisy never told Tom that she, not Gatsby, was actually the person that ran Myrtle over. As you can see in the second underlined line, it says, he ran over Myrtle like you'd run over a dog and never even stopped his car. Daisy has not owned up to the fact to Tom that she had actually, in fact, killed Myrtle. And so Tom believes that it is Gatsby's fault, even if George was also hunting Gatsby down because he believed that Gatsby was the one that Myrtle was having an affair with. And so Tom and Daisy are both proven as selfish and liars. And if you didn't think I had my share of suffering, look here, when I went up to give up that flat and saw the damn box of dog biscuits sitting there on the sideboard, I sat down and cried like a baby. By God, it was awful. And so Tom is trying to have a pity party for himself. I couldn't forgive him or like him, but I saw that what he had done was, to him, entirely justified. So Tom, in his brain, does not think that he has done anything wrong. He believes Gatsby deserved it. He believes Gatsby deceived Daisy and Nick and therefore should die, right? In his brain, he has done nothing wrong. It was all very careless and confused. And here's a great quote that you all should write down. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made. I shook hands with him. It seemed silly not to, for I felt suddenly as though I were talking to a child. Then he went into the jewelry store to buy a pearl necklace, or perhaps only a pair of cuff buttons, rid of my provincial squeamishness forever. So again, this highlights the selfishness, the carelessness, and just the lack of concern that Tom and Daisy have for other people. They do what they want, they use who they want, and they're able to just wash their hands and walk away while everyone else is destroyed, dead, or in serious trouble because of it. And you see that in the death of not only Myrtle, not only George, but also of Gatsby. And what we once thought as Tom's major flaw is also now applied to Daisy, unfortunately. And again, you see Nick's growth too, right? Where he says, you know what? I'm going to be the bigger man. I'm going to shake his hand. And I realize that this guy is not a bully. He's not intimidating. He's a child, right? He doesn't take responsibility for his actions. He breaks something and he runs away, expecting that a servant or his mother or somebody is going to pick it up for him. And so he really sees Tom for who he is and is no longer intimidated by him. Gatsby's house was still empty when I left. The grass on his lawn had grown as long as mine. One of the taxi drivers in the village never took a fare past the entrance without stopping for a minute and pointing inside. Perhaps it was he who drove Daisy and Gatsby over to East Egg the night of the accident, and perhaps he had made a story about it all on his own. I didn't want to hear it, and I avoided him when I got off the train. I spent my Saturday nights in New York because those gleaming, dazzling parties of his were with me so vividly that I could still hear the music and the laughter, faint and incessant, from his garden, and the cars going up and down his drive. One night I did hear a material car there, and saw its lights stop at his front steps, but I didn't investigate. Probably it was some final guest who had been away at the ends of the earth and didn't know the party was over. On the last night, with my trunk packed and my car sold to the grocer, I went over and looked at the huge, incoherent failure of a house once more, On the white steps of an obscene word, scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick, stood out clearly in the moonlight, and I erased it, drawing my shoe raspingly along the stone. Then I wandered down to the beach and sprawled out on the sand. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy, moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes. A fresh, green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house and had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human desires and dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired. Face to face for the first time in history with something commensurate for his capacity of wonder. So there's a lot of big words in this paragraph, but essentially Nick is walking through Gatsby's house and he goes back onto that dock and he's kind of just taking it all in. And it's nighttime, and for a moment he imagines what it was like for the first settlers of New York, the Dutch sailors' eyes, to behold a completely fresh, new, vibrant land that hadn't been settled. And again, like, Fitzgerald doesn't include anything about the Native Americans in this, but the idea that it's unsettled, it's not populated, and the idea of hope, and that nobody has settled this. It is a fresh start. It is something that is new and grand, and you can create it into whatever you want it to be because you were there first. And so he's comparing this dock and looking out of the dock and imagining what it was like for those first settlers. And then he brings it back to Gatsby and connects these two ideas. And as I sat there brooding on the old, unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to his blue lawn, or the sound, right? A blue lawn, it's the ocean stretching in front of him. And his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city where the dark fields of the Republic rolled under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow, we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And that is probably one of the most famous lines of all American literature, of all literature in general. It's right up there with every other massive classic. And there's a lot to unpack here, and we're not going to do it in the Ed puzzle because we're going to do it in the close reading together as a class. But this is Fitzgerald's kind of final commentary on those topics that we've been discussing of love, of wealth, of hope, and what encapsulates all of those things, what encapsulates those first settlers, those first people who came to America and created America to be what it is today. The people who formed the Declaration of Independence, the people who came here to flee religious persecution and start anew and create themselves from the ground up. It is the idea of the American dream. And this commentary at the end is Fitzgerald's opinion on that, and that idea that it is a beautiful, wonderful, hope-filled idea. And to Gatsby, that idea was also encapsulated by that green light. But in the end, is the American dream something that is a dream worth having?